I hadn't been back to the village in years, not since I was a boy, chasing after the summer sun in the fields and splashing through the creek that twisted through the trees. Life had changed since then, drawing me away to the city, where the air was thick with noise and the nights were restless. But now, after all those years, I found myself standing at the edge of that familiar dirt road, the village nestled like a forgotten relic between the hills. I was here to look after my grandfather. The old man had lived in the village his entire life. He'd been a fixture, someone who everyone knew but few understood. Age had weathered him, turned his skin thin and gray, but his sharp, cold eyes had never dulled. They still carried that same piercing quality, the same intensity, as if he was always watching, always calculating something no one else could see. When I first arrived, I expected warmth, maybe a flicker of nostalgia. But the moment I walked through the door of his old, creaking house, there was only silence. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint scent of damp wood and something else I couldn't place. Grandfather greeted me with a nod, but his expression never shifted. His eyes, sharp and hollow, lingered on me longer than I liked. He never said much, not anymore. The man who had once told stories of the old days, of strange things lurking in the woods at the edge of the village, had become an almost ghostly presence in his own home. He spent most of his time staring out the window, watching the road as if expecting something, or someone. Then there were the night walks. It started the first evening I stayed. After dinner, just as the last traces of light faded from the sky, Grandfather stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. Without a word, he slipped on his coat and hat, opening the front door to the cool night air. "Where are you going?" I had asked, more out of curiosity than concern. "Walk," he replied in a gravelly voice, not bothering to look back as he stepped outside. I watched from the window as he made his way down the narrow road, his hunched figure disappearing into the night. 10 minutes later, like clockwork, he returned as if nothing had happened. He didn't speak of it and I didn't ask. But the walks continued. Every night, just after dark, he would rise, put on his coat, and leave. Always the same. Always 10 minutes. At first, I thought it was just a habit, maybe a way for him to clear his mind. But there was something unsettling about it, something in the way he moved, so deliberate, so ritualistic. His eyes, cold and distant, would fix on me for a second before he left, and each time, it felt like a warning, like he knew something I didn't. As the days passed, I became more and more aware of those eyes, how they followed me, how they seemed to strip away any pretense, as if Grandfather was looking right through me, seeing things I didn't even understand about myself. It wasn't just the way he looked at me though. It was the feeling that came with it. A creeping sensation like an itch beneath my skin that something wasn't right. One night, after watching him return from his usual walk, I couldn't shake the feeling. The way he moved, the way his eyes gleamed just before he left, it gnawed at me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering where he went. What was out there that drew him into the dark night, night after night? The village was small, with little more than a few houses, a general store, and endless fields that stretched into the horizon. Yet every night, Grandfather walked that road, his figure swallowed by the shadows beyond the edge of the village. And every night, I became more aware of how little I understood about him. Then came the night he didn't return. It started the same way it always did. We ate dinner in silence, the clinking of silverware against plates the only sound in the house. The air felt thick, heavy, as if something unseen hung between us. Grandfather rose, his movements slow, methodical. He didn't look at me as he put on his coat this time, just headed straight for the door. The latch clicked softly behind him. I waited. 10 minutes passed. The sound of the old clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking each second, each minute. I listened for the familiar creak of the front door, for the shuffle of his boots as he returned. But the house remained quiet. 15 minutes. I got up from the chair and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, twisted shadows across the road. But Grandfather was nowhere to be seen. 20 minutes. The longer I stood there, staring into the night, the more uneasy I became. He always came back after 10 minutes. Every night it was the same. But tonight, the road was empty, and the silence weighed heavier with each passing second. My pulse quickened. I couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong, terribly wrong. I stepped outside, the cool night air biting at my skin. The village was quiet, the houses dark. A faint wind rustled the trees at the edge of the woods, carrying with it the scent of earth and decay. I walked to the edge of the road, scanning the fields and the woods beyond. Still nothing. My mind raced with questions, none of them having any answers. Where had he gone? Why hadn't he returned? And why, as I stood there in the moonlight, did I feel like someone, or something, was watching me from the darkness beyond the village? I lingered there, listening, waiting. But the night gave nothing away. No sounds, no footsteps, no sign of my grandfather. Just the cold wind, and the unsettling quiet that pressed in from all sides. And then, for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt it. A presence. Something out there, in the dark, watching. I don't know what made me do it, whether it was the mounting anxiety gnawing at the edges of my mind or the cold, almost unnatural quiet of the village that night, but I couldn't just stand there anymore. The longer I stared down that empty road, the more the unease settled deep into my bones. Grandfather had always come back. Always. And yet now, the road stretched out before me, silent and empty, leading into the thick woods that surrounded the village like a dark, endless sea. I had to find him. Grabbing my jacket, I stepped off the porch and onto the road. The dirt path crunched beneath my boots, the sound far too loud in the stillness. The moon hung low in the sky, casting everything in a pale, eerie light. As I made my way toward the edge of the village, a strange thought crept into my mind, one I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. Why had grandfather gone out every night? What was he doing out there? My footsteps quickened, though my mind fought to keep pace with my growing sense of dread. The village was small, no more than a cluster of houses, some abandoned, their windows dark and hollow. The fields beyond were empty, overgrown with tall grass that swayed gently in the night breeze. The road itself seemed to disappear into the trees up ahead, where the shadows grew thicker, darker. The further I walked, the more the unease built in my chest. The night air was cool, but there was a heaviness to it, as if the very atmosphere had shifted, pressing down on me from all sides. I passed the last house, the one that had always seemed abandoned even in my childhood. Its dark windows seemed to watch me as I moved past, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Not when every fiber of my being screamed that something was wrong, something was out there, waiting in the dark. I entered the woods, the canopy above blocking out much of the moonlight. The path became narrower, overgrown with weeds and thorny bushes. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches casting long, jagged shadows on the ground. The sound of my breathing filled my ears, and I realized I had been holding my breath without even noticing. At first there was nothing unusual. Just the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl. But then as I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. The smell. It was faint at first but unmistakable, the metallic tang of blood. My pace slowed as I scanned the area, my heart beginning to race. And that's when I saw it. A smear of blood on the bark of a tree. It wasn't much, just a thin streak as if something had brushed against it in passing. But it was fresh. I stepped closer, reaching out to touch it, my fingers coming away sticky and red. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just some animal wound. This was human blood. Grandfather? I called out into the trees, my voice shaky, unsure. Only silence answered me. I kept moving, my eyes scanning the ground for any more signs. A sinking feeling was growing in my gut, twisting tighter with each step I took. The further I walked, the more I began to notice drops of blood on the leaves, the dirt. I followed the trail, each step taking me deeper into the woods, each drop of blood pulling me further from the village, further from safety. And then I saw it. Grandfather's coat, tattered and bloodied, lying crumpled on the ground, half hidden beneath a pile of leaves. My chest tightened, my pulse racing. I knelt down, picking it up with trembling hands. The dark stains of blood soaked the fabric, fresh and sticky. My mind raced with questions, none of them having any comforting answers. What had happened to him? Was he injured? Hurt? Or worse? Grandfather? I called again, louder this time. But the forest remained silent, as though the trees themselves were listening, watching. I kept moving, fear driving me forward now, the blood trail becoming more pronounced. That's when I found the second piece. His shirt. It was torn, bloodied, and draped over a fallen log. I picked it up, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely hold on to it. The shirt was old, one I had seen him wear countless times, white with thin blue stripes. Now it was stained dark red, ripped at the collar as though it had been yanked off in a struggle. Panic gripped me. What had happened to him? Why was there so much blood? My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe he had been attacked by a wild animal. Maybe he had fallen and injured himself. Maybe. A sudden movement caught my eye. In the distance between the trees, a figure darted past. A hunched figure, moving quickly, almost erratically. My heart leapt into my throat. Grandfather! I shouted, starting to run toward the figure. Grandfather, wait! The figure stopped for a moment just at the edge of the clearing and I caught a glimpse of him. It was him, Grandfather, his familiar stooped form, his white hair catching the moonlight as he stood there, swaying slightly. But something was wrong. He was laughing. It was a low, rasping laugh that sent chills down my spine. My steps faltered, confusion and fear wrestling inside me. "Grandfather?" I called out again, my voice barely a whisper now. Suddenly he turned, his movements quick, too quick for someone his age. He sprinted toward me with unnatural speed, his bare feet kicking up dirt and leaves. I stumbled backward, falling to the ground, panic overtaking me. He was right in front of me now, his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. But it wasn't the grandfather I knew. His clothes were in tatters, blood smeared across his hands and chest. And his face. His face was twisted into the most grotesque grin I had ever seen, stretching impossibly wide, revealing teeth stained dark red. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. "Grandfather, what happened? Who did this to you?" For a moment he said nothing. He just stood there, his breathing heavy, his grin never faltering. And then, with that same rasping voice, he whispered, "You can try to protect me." The words slithered through the air like poison, sending a jolt of terror through me. Before I could react, he took a step forward, his grin widening, and dropped to his knees. For a brief moment, I thought he was collapsing, maybe from exhaustion or injury. But then, as if on cue, he rose again, his body contorting in ways that no human body should. And then he laughed again, louder this time, manic, uncontrollable. "You can try," he rasped, his voice dripping with mockery, "but you won't survive the night." I stumbled back, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I was frozen. My mind refused to process what was happening, refused to accept the thing standing in front of me. And as I stood there, paralyzed by fear, he lunged at me, his cold, bloodied hands reaching for my throat. No one in the village saw me after that night.